That is the piped-in sound of a Chevy Camaro engine revving during the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange this morning. It was a good day on the stock market, and a good day in particular for the people you just saw opening the stock market there, the folks from General Motors. GM had their big initial stock offering on Wall Street today. It helped drive the whole stock exchange higher. The Dow closed up 173 points today. Now, because the government bailed out GM, this is not just an American business story, it's also a politics story. And there's a little bit of awkwardness in them there, politics, over the fact that GM is doing really well right now.
I mean, you know what's going to happen. Congressmen are going to be causing the president of General Motors to drive his hybrid car to Washington to talk about hiring your grandmother, what kind of car you're going to have, what are you going to paint it, where are you going to buy your engine. They're not going to be having time to make any cars.
That was Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee making a very specific, very odd prediction last year about what would happen to GM because of the government bailout. And, you know, people make bad predictions. It happens all the time. I am a very bad predictor myself. You might remember me saying that Hillary Clinton was going to have a big floor fight at the Democratic Convention in 2008. Yeah, that one did not pan out. So I have sympathy and empathy for people who say things are going to work out a certain way and then they don't. And a lot of Republicans made the same bad prediction, dire prediction about GM. A lot of them said when the Obama administration wanted to bail out GM that it would just be a disaster. It wasn't just Lamar Alexander. It was Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and John Kyle and Richard Shelby and Jim DeMint in the Senate, Minority Leader John Boehner and Tom Price and Eric Cantor and Trent Franks in the House, and RNC Chairman Michael Steele, just to name a few. They all said the GM bailout would not work, and it worked. GM's first day in the stock market was today. It was the biggest IPO in American history. GM made more money in its initial stock offering than any U.S. company ever. Today for GM was bigger than Google's first day on the stock market or eBay's or any other American company you can think of. Today, GM raised more than $20 billion. Also in the past week, the car that more than anything GM is staking its future on, the Chevy Volt, won Motor Trend's Car of the Year. This is not a we feel sorry for you, way to make an effort, most improved kind of award. This is Motor Trend's Car of the Year. This is a real award. This is like best car, period. Point is, it's a very good time for General Motors. To be clear, GM, because of the government bailout, did not go out of business. A brand new study from the Center for Automotive Research found the bailout of GM and Chrysler saved 1.4 million jobs. And now, with the new financial health of the company, GM is on track to have its first profitable year since 2004 and to pay the government back the bailout money. It is a success. It's one thing to predict that something in America is going to fail and then have it not fail, right? So what? You got it wrong. But pleasant surprise, right? Things went well for the country. You thought they wouldn't. You were a little too cynical. America ended up actually winning out. Isn't that good news? You know, so what? You got your prediction wrong. That I understand. What I don't understand is not being psyched that something went right in America. Now that we know that the GM bailout worked, and it worked beautifully, what do you make of critics of President Obama on the right who still wish that it had not happened? Or better yet, who deny that there was any success at all?
They plowed ahead from the very beginning with one piece of legislation after another written by liberals for liberals. And so by the spring of 2009, they had bailed out automakers that should have been allowed to reorganize or to fail.
You look at the GM bailout today, an example of huge federal intervention, a bailout of a private company, and yet today GM is still around, going to do its IPO, taxpayers in a position to get back a big chunk of that money and potentially millions of jobs saved. Does that in any way diminish your feeling that Washington should have a much diminished role?
No, as a matter of fact, it probably is a good exhibit of why government should not be involved in the private sector. The fact of the matter is those jobs would not have been lost. They may have been transitioned by a private sector acquisition of GM.
Just so I understand you, you're not saying that if GM had gone bankrupt, no jobs would be lost?
Oh, I don't know whether there would have been any jobs lost or not, but at the end of the day, that's how the process is supposed to work. If you have a company that is not profitable, then it goes through bankruptcy, and it shakes out.
The GM bailout worked. 1.4 million American jobs saved. The bailout money on track to being paid back. The company in good shape and getting better all the time. GM is working. Here's a question for you, Governor. Are you for that or are you against that? Joining us now is Ron Bloom, Senior Advisor to the Secretary of the Treasury and member of the President's Task Force on the Automotive Industry. Mr. Bloom, thank you for your time today.
Great to be here.
What does today's stock offering say about the health of GM and the wisdom of this bailout?
Well, I think it's a good day. I think it's a good day for the country. It's a good day for General Motors, but it's a good day for the country. Look, 17 months ago, this company did enter bankruptcy, but if it had been allowed to enter bankruptcy on an uncontrolled basis, which is what some of our critics seem to think it should have done, it would have gone into liquidation. And as you pointed out, Rachel, studies have shown at least 1 million, maybe 2 million jobs would have been lost. And the entire automobile industry in America could have come apart at that point, because the automobile industry in America is very interconnected. The Ford Motor Company, who didn't go into bankruptcy, applauded our decision to help GM because they understood that if the suppliers who supply GM had been allowed, GM had failed, the suppliers would have failed, and Ford wouldn't have been able to make cars, nor would Honda and Toyota. So the entire automobile industry was at risk. The President stepped forward. This was an extraordinary time. Let's remember, we were in the depths of the worst recession since the Great Depression. He insisted on tough sacrifice from all the stakeholders at GM. This was a difficult deal, but the stakeholders came together, the employees, the managers, the creditors, the suppliers, the dealers. Everyone came together and agreed to make tough sacrifices, and on that basis and that basis alone, the President extended a helping hand. And General Motors has now taken a very important step forward. As you pointed out, today over $20 billion of private capital said that they believe in General Motors, and I think that's a pretty good day for America. And the President and the Obama administration is doing what we said we would do. We are exiting this investment as soon as practical because we don't think in the long run it is proper for the government to own these companies. But in an extraordinary time when the economy is teetering, to lend a helping hand to those who are willing to execute self-help as well seems to me to make all the sense in the world. And I think today is a very important validation of that strategy.
Governor Perry, speaking in that quote that we played from him there, is essentially making the case that the government shouldn't have gotten involved on principle, saying that's how the process is supposed to work. If you have a company that's not profitable, then it goes through bankruptcy and it all shakes out. He's essentially making the case that this rewards mismanagement. It sends the wrong message in terms of capitalism, sets up the wrong incentives. What's your response to that?
Well, I'd say two things. Number one, this was not an ordinary time. This was an extraordinary time, number one. Number two, General Motors is, because of the place it sits in the economy, absolutely critical to a very, very broad base of our economy. And so this is not just any company, and it's not just the jobs at General Motors that were at stake. General Motors at the time was employing maybe 70 or 80,000 people. We're talking about over 1 million people whose jobs would have been at risk. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think we can't underestimate the sacrifice that the President did insist on from the stakeholders of General Motors. This was not some fairy godmother thing where the Obama administration came along and said, we'll give you anything you want. Retirees took reductions in their health care benefits. That's a very difficult thing to do. Workers took pay cuts. Creditors took reductions in the obligations they were owed. There was a wholesale reorganization of the GM management. The board of directors had a huge overhaul. Dealers, unfortunately, couldn't continue to sell their cars, and suppliers took sacrifice. So this was a very tough-minded restructuring. And of course we worry about this issue, the governor appears to be discussing, of the moral hazard. But I don't think this is a good example at all of that. This is a very, very tough deal. But what it shows is when people come together and when we are at a moment of extraordinary crisis and when they're prepared to sacrifice, I think it's entirely appropriate that the government lend a helping hand.
Ron Bloom, Senior Advisor to the Secretary of the Treasury and a member of the President's Task Force on the Automotive Industry. Thanks for helping us understand this, sir. Appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks to be here.